everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with a short video about why you should play Burn and what is the deck in particular. This is a remake of a video I did probably about a year and a half ago. I figured that the audio could use a little bit of an improvement, maybe a little bit more clear explanation about what's going on. As a friendly reminder, if you like red-based content for MTG, whether it be Pioneer, Modern, or Legacy, please consider subscribing to the channel. We do focus mainly on Modern Burn, but we do cover those other formats as well for those particular things, such as Burn, Prowess, etc. But you're here to learn about what is Burn. Burn is an aggressive base deck, which means its objective is to get the opponent dead as quickly as possible. Usually they are red-based decks, so every deck has its own, or every color has its own ability to be aggressive, but red kind of features cards that are efficient at going at the opponent's face, called direct damage spells or burn spells, and also tends to have a lot of creatures that have the key mechanic word haste, which means they can attack the turn they come down, which is obviously important when you're trying to quickly reduce your opponent's life total. Toward that end, it is a deck that specializes in running efficient creatures and direct damage spells. So basically most of the creatures in these decks are 1 and 2 mana. They try to get in their damage in the early turns, and then you generally try to finish off your opponent with efficient spells, with the key card being the iconic card Lightning Bolt. Let's take a look at some of the examples of decks. This is Pioneer, which is Wizards' latest Eternal Offering. You'll notice in this version, you do see a lot of the same creatures you'll see in other things, but you do see Monastery Swiftspear, which is a 1/2 with a keyword prowess, and so is Soulscar Mage is a keyword prowess, which basically means every time you cast a non-creature spell, it gets pumped till the end of turn. Key 2 Lava Runner is a 1/2 that whenever you have 2 or more instants or sorceries in your graveyard, gets pumped up to a 2/2 and has haste. And then Eidolon of the Great Revel is a card that basically says it's a 2/2 for 2 red mana, comes into play, and basically says anybody that casts a spell costing 3 or less, that player takes 2 damage. Now obviously that hits us as well, but we're trying to reduce our opponent's life total, try to get ahead on life, and then Eidolon kind of helps to finish them off. Beyond that, in this format, it's running burn spells such as Wild Slash and Shock. Also cards like Lightning Strike, Boros Charm, Wizard's Lightning, and a card called Light Up the Stage. Most of these are efficient burn spells. Wild Slash does 2 damage, Shock does 2 damage, Boros Charm does 4 damage, only to players primarily, and has some utility in making your permanents indestructible or one of your creatures can't double strike. Ash Zealot's an interesting creature that sees some play. It's a 2/2 haster for 2 that has a ability. Basically says that anytime something gets cast from the graveyard, that player takes 3 damage. Then Wizard's Lightning is a 3 damage, 3 mana spell, but you do have a lot of subtype wizards in your deck, so this allows you to cast a effectively Lightning Bolt in a format that doesn't possess Lightning Bolt. And then most burn decks in Modern and Pioneer tend to splash white for some sideboard cards. This version is using it for Rest in Peace, for Graveyard Hate, and Chain to the Rocks as permanent-based removal for some of the more difficult to answer creatures. As far as the modern burn deck, what you might see, this deck looks remarkably similar to the Pioneer one. You do have Monastery Swiftspear and Eidolon, but it also gets an upgrade in a card called Goblin Guide. Goblin Guide is a 2/2 haster for 1, so very efficient as a creature. It does have the downside of revealing the top card of your opponent's library, and if it's a land, they put it into their hand. And then the rest of the deck is just more efficient spells than you see out of the Pioneer version. So cards like Lightning Bolt, Lightning Helix, Searing Blaze, which is a card that targets a creature and a player. And then Skullcrack prevents life gain. And then Roiling Vortex is an enchantment that deals 1 damage to each player during their turn. And you can pay red to prevent your opponents from gaining life. So it's a one-sided way of keeping your opponent from gaining life. Very efficient deck. Tries to get the opponent dead. This is an example of some of the sideboard cards you see. Core Firewalker is a protection from red thing that's primarily for the mirror match. Hushbringer shuts down enter the battlefield abilities for creatures. Path to Exile replaces Chain to the Rocks as a universal removal spell. Relic of Progenitus is a graveyard hate that we saw Rest in Peace in the previous list. Wear Tear, you can only see obviously the the Tear side, but basically this is a split spell that allows you to target a enchantment or an artifact and remove it. And then Skullcrack to help prevent life gain damage. And finally, you have an example of a Legacy deck. You're going to see a lot of the same spells, a lot of the same creatures, although noticing that this version is mono red. You're playing the same creatures, but you do have other spells. Lightning Bolt, in addition to the iconic Lightning Bolt, you have Chain Lightning here, which is a spell. It's basically a sorcery speed lightning bolt that if your opponent happens to have 2 red open, they can return it and target something else. And then it gains the access to cards like Price of Progress, which basically deals 2 damage to each player for each non-basic land they control. We don't control any non-basics in our all-mountain deck. Then Fire Blast, which seems like a very expensive spell, 4 and 2 red. However, has an alternative casting cost that allows you to cast the spell by sacrificing 2 mountains. So it's frequently used as a finisher. And then obviously you play a little bit different hate cards in your Eternal format, such as that. Those are all just examples of the deck. So why should you play Burn? The main reasons, first off, it's a fast gameplay with a few important decisions. So if you're going to be playing a long tournament, or if you happen to have a very busy life and you can't master, the intricacies of combo or control, this gives you a fast deck that allows you to still go and play Magic, while also not requiring you to know a lot of what's going on. The games only typically last 4 to 6 turns, depending on the format, obviously. That means the games are going to be over fairly quickly. And then one of the keys is sequencing and maximizing damage are keys to the deck. So basically how and when you play your spells are important. So when you have a handful of creatures and spells, which ones do you play first, etc. Another advantage of the deck is it attacks on multiple axes. So most creature-based decks only attack on the basis of the creatures themselves, or they might have some disruption in the form of things like counter spells or discard spells. Burn has the multi-pronged thing of having both the efficient, hasty creatures, while also having spells that can deal directly damage to your opponent's face. Meaning, your opponent's hand of all removal spells isn't going to be enough to deal with all your threats. And also, your opponent's full of counter spells. If you have a bunch of creatures in play, beating them down, eventually they're going to have to deal with those creatures or they die, and they can't just sit back behind all their counter spells. Finally, what issues does Burn have as a deck? Requires a critical mass of spells. So some decks you can mulligan, or that is you put back your hand and draw on another hand and reduce it by 1. Burn is not a deck that mulligans particularly well, because most of their deck deals a finite amount of damage. Lightning Bolt deals 3 damage, Boros Charm does 4 damage. The only cards that can potentially deal more damage than on the surface is the creatures, and if your opponent can answer those, then you need to draw more spells. So mulligans are a huge negative for the deck. However, the cards are quite redundant, so you don't often have to mulligan all that much unless you're missing lands. Life Gain is a hard counter to this deck largely. Most Life Gain itself negates a card out of your deck. But Life Gain in and of itself is not enough, because if you play a long game against Burn and don't kill them, they are eventually going to draw enough spells to kill you as long as you haven't gained infinite life. Another counter to this deck is bigger creatures. The key thing on most red spells is they deal 3 damage. So creatures with 4 damage or greater often require multiple cards to deal with. That's why you see in a lot of these builds they're playing things like Chain of the Rocks, Path to Exile. That allows you the red-based deck to answer cards that they would obviously have issues dealing with. And then bigger creatures can obviously, especially if they come down fairly quickly, like on turn 2 or turn 3, which some decks are capable of producing, 3 mana 5/5s or 2 mana 5 or 4/5s. They can blank your creatures, which are important, and make you more rely on your spells to finish the game. Burn is often considered a intro deck to Magic. It is a deck that some people disrespect. Some people have a huge fondness for the deck. Basically, it's a fast and brutal deck that allows you to get games over quickly, and it is very easy to pick up and play, but it is a very difficult deck to master. You can probably pick up the first 85-90% of Burn just by literally looking at your cards and playing them, and then the last 10% you have to learn as you play the deck over time. So it kind of has the reputation of being a very easy to play deck, but at the same time it's also a deck that can take quite a bit of time to master. And I'm not even sure that there are still some things, even having played Burn for many years, that I'm still not sure about, like some hands of mulliganing, etc. So this hasn't been an intro to Burn. If you like this kind of content, please consider hitting the subscribe button, giving us a thumbs up if you like this kind of video, and if you really would like to support this channel, there's a link down to our Patreon page that is the best way to support the channel monetarily. As always, this has been John for MTG Nexus with your burn content.